province. There are many, many, many cities mentioned in the Bible. We're going to look at some of them next week when we look at geography. But those cities, the importance isn't necessarily the layout or the structure. The importance there, like on Paul's missionary journey, is where they're located. So that's why they're not included here today. Okay. Ancient cities, especially in Middle East, Canaan region, which is modern-day Israel, is the landscape there. It's not forests. It's when they speak about wilderness, it's barren. There's not a lot there. So when they built cities, when they found a water source, usually a spring, underground water source, they would build their city right on top of that water source. They didn't have reliable means to transport massive amounts of water in David's period. So where the water was, that's where the city was. When a city was besieged and destroyed for whatever reason, it happened often. The civilization, because that's where the water source is, they can't pack up and build the city somewhere else. They would literally flatten out whatever there was left, roll all the stones back up, and start from scratch, rebuild the city right on top of where the old one used to be. So when archaeologists dig into these ruins, they actually find layers of civilization, very distinct layers. And they call these layers tells or tills. We'll look at an example later. Because of the size of the water source, again, and the need to fortify the city, it didn't grow very large. A lot of Canaanite cities, especially in Joshua's day when they were invading, only supported around a few thousand people at a time. But there were many hundreds of cities, so you add up the population, it was a sizable population, but each city wasn't more than a few thousand people. The biggest one was, I think, 10,000 mentioned in Joshua. That's one of the ones that they destroyed. But in Joshua, he said they were actually told not to completely destroy the cities. It says that their homes will become your homes, that they took the cities and they just moved in, and that was common as well. And then it was just heavily fortified because of the turmoil and the unsettled nature of the time of that period. There were sieges going on all the time for various reasons. Okay, Jerusalem. That picture there is actually a picture of modern-day Jerusalem, specifically of the old city. That's more or less where ancient Jerusalem was built. Now, Jerusalem is the size of Johannesburg, okay? It's a massive city with a population of millions. But there's a small area in the middle. It's called the Old City, and it's divided. There's a section for the Muslim population, a section for the Christian population, and the Jewish population, so that they don't step on each other's toes. And I think that's the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. It's a church built on the place that they think Jesus was crucified, but that's a whole other story. That's what it looks like today. The first time period we're going to look at is in the time of David. Okay, David king of Israel. He ruled 7 years before he actually conquered Jerusalem. Now, hundreds of years before, they were unable to. The Bible says that when the Israelites invaded Canaan, they were actually unable to capture the city, and so they just left it. So David finished the job, so to speak. It's very small. It's very relatively the size of most of the cities back then. And here at the bottom, you see this area here. This is the Gibbon Spring. This is the spring that the city was built around. And they had fortified it to protect it from outside invasion. So the modus operandi would be to find this spring and poison it or capture it, or if the city inside didn't have water, they were unable to maintain any kind of defense. So the idea was that many times they would hide it, they would disguise the entrance, they would, in this case, build a fort around it. And we see in 2 Samuel 5 and 1 Chronicles 11 that he actually captured the city by finding a way into the water source and following the tunnel up into the city. And that's how David actually captured Jerusalem from the inside. Another interesting fact about this is that it's the same city that's mentioned in Genesis 4. It's called Salem back then, Melchizedek the king. And when David conquers it, it's called Jebus. So I didn't read this anywhere, but it kind of makes sense that Jerusalem is sort of an amalgamation of those two names. I never thought about it. It mentions this Millo. It's basically just a construction, a slope construction that they built houses on. There's a lot of writing here. The source that I got it from, I'm sure if you Google it, you can find it as well. And again, that free study Bible I mentioned has these illustrations in as well. Okay, any questions? Oh, and wait, this hill up here, this is eventually where the temple would be built. Any questions? Jerusalem, time of David. Okay. Okay, so I actually put it in. They taunt David, and then they say, and then he says, whoever attacks the Jebusites shall be chief and captain. And Joab, the son of Zeruiah, went up first and became chief. So 2 Samuel actually tells us that he went up into the passage where the spring was and then conquered the fort. And David lived in the fort until he built his palace. Okay. So let's fast forward a very long time. Several hundred years later, the nation of Israel, the remnant, had returned from exile, and they were going to rebuild Jerusalem. It was destroyed. It was completely leveled by the Babylonians in more or less 500 BC. And they came back and they said, okay, we're going to rebuild. We're going to start afresh. So this area here is all ruins. This was never rebuilt. This was expanded. King Hezekiah, one of the kings of Israel, so when they returned, they just built the wall around there, a very small, very modest Jerusalem compared to even David's time. And this was all left abandoned. It wasn't reconstructed until history tells us 100 or 200 years before Christ. The temple, they did rebuild the temple. It's up there, more or less where the original one stood that Solomon built. And then down here is a pool of Siloam, I think. So what they did was they created a little dam area and they siphoned water from that Gibbon spring to this pool, and it filled up like a little dam just to make the water source more accessible for the people. So I'm just giving you snippets of what Jerusalem might have looked like throughout periods in history. Okay, so here's a better example. This is the expansion I mentioned that Hezekiah added that was never rebuilt. That's the ruins. This orange piece is the city of David, the original Jerusalem. And then this purple on this side is what they rebuilt under Nehemiah. And this orange line is present-day Jerusalem, Old City. There's a wall around it, so you can more or less tell where that was. Any questions? I got you guys are easy today. All right. So as you can see, the time of Jesus, a lot has changed. It's quite different. From 10,000 to 50,000 plus population. There's the temple. There's the pool of Siloam, much bigger. Almost every part of the city is expanded. A palace was built. And this is in large part due to Roman ingenuity. They supplied aqueducts to the city. There was an aqueduct leading into this pool, actually, and several others. An aqueduct running all the way from Bethlehem, which was about 9 miles. So how much is that? 12, 13 kilometers from Jerusalem. Massive water source bringing water into Jerusalem. And that's why they could support more people, and how the city expanded to the size that we see there. In the book in the Gospels and Acts, events happen all over the city. I found a map. It wasn't very good quality, but it lists Bible verses and then arrows where things happened in the city. So this was very awesome for me to see. In the first lesson, we looked at the temple and we saw various things happening there. As an example, I don't have it down in John 9:7. Jesus heals a blind man and he tells him to go wash his face in the pool of Siloam, which is down here, and he does, and then he sees again. So that's just one example. Any questions on that? Okay. This slide was actually supposed to be earlier, I'm sorry. In Nehemiah, it tells us, it gives us a detailed account of how they rebuilt the wall. And they said, here's just a snippet. The sons of Hassanah built the fish gate and they laid their beams. Next to them, Meremoth and the sons of Urijah And if you follow the passage, you can actually see this very clever person. I didn't draw this. I found it on several websites, so I couldn't actually locate the original source. They had illustrated it on as the families built their section of the wall. Each family was assigned a section of the wall and gate that they had to repair until it went all the way around, and this guy actually laid it out for us to see. So that's detailed in Nehemiah 3. I thought that was really cool to actually see laid out like that. Okay, other ancient cities. Any questions about Jerusalem? All right. So here's just 3 cities that I thought would be interesting to explore. This is the artist's rendition of Babylon, ancient Babylon, as it more or less would have appeared during the time of Nebuchadnezzar. They built a city right on top of the Euphrates River, which is there. It's a massive water source, again, water and road access. The question is, why didn't they just find a river or a dam and build the city there? It was a combination of water and accessibility. But it seemed like they got lucky, I guess. And they found... so at the time, it was one of the biggest cities in the world. And it's been housed many civilizations. Like I said, they weren't in the habit of destroying cities. They were in the habit of taking it over. So Babylon was home to the, the Akkadians, the Chaldeans, the Assyrians, the Persians, and the list goes on. So this is a very old city. If you see in the picture, there's this big blue structure there. We'll explain that now. And then this structure there, the ziggurat. We'll look at those 2 things. Okay, that big blue gate, the Ishtar Gate, was a monument built by the emperor. And this is what do you call it? A recreation of that. This is standing in a museum in Berlin, one-to-one recreation. And we can recreate it because the archaeologists found a very clear, very detailed inscription on the ruins of this gate, explaining what it looks like, how it was built, who built it, the purpose, so they could actually recreate it exactly like that. Here's just part of the inscription that they found. I pulled down these gates and laid their foundation at the water table, asphalt and brick, and made the brick with blue stone, on which wonderful bulls and dragons were depicted. And then at the bottom, it says, I placed wild bulls and fierce dragons in the gateway and thus adorned them with luxurious splendor so that mankind may gaze upon them in wonder. So in Genesis, with the Tower of Babel, which is, I think the arrogance part of that civilization might have carried through a bit. The ziggurat that was in the rendition was about 7 stories high. It was a structure that they used for idol worship, and it predates, Roman pantheons and stuff. They also found a ziggurat like that or similar in the city of Ur. Okay, Ur is a city where Abraham was from. It's modern-day Iran, I think. And they had excavated it in the 1800s, I think early 1900s. And they found the city of Ur, and there was ziggurat to idol worship. Yes. Yes, the second. He made a very large point, several paragraphs in this inscription of who he is. Yeah, no, it's very prideful, I guess. Okay, the next one is actually Capper. I'm going to try and pronounce it. I always had the pronunciation wrong, okay? Capernaum, that's how you say it. Capernaum. Capernaum. You can smooth that out and say just Capernaum or something, but it's Capernaum. Okay, so in the Gospels, Jesus makes several trips here, and there's two things in the city specifically that is mentioned. Firstly, the synagogue, and secondly, a house that he stayed in. So here is this photo here at the top was the ruins of this city. This is a while ago. This is when they first dug it up. It's a tourist destination now. I got this picture of sites of the Holy Land, so you can visit it and see. This is most likely the synagogue, although the construction is very incomplete. There's another synagogue in Gamla or something that's much more complete. So they, a lot of what we understand about ancient synagogues actually comes from that other one. But this is more or less Capernaum. It's not very large. It was a harbor city on the Sea of Galilee towards the north. And it mentions the synagogue. So I'll just explain to you. I didn't find a good picture, but a construction of the synagogue would have actually been not too unlike a church. It had a large auditorium-like space where they would meet and teach. And then it had a cabinet off to the side in the auditorium space where the scrolls and the law was kept. And then it had several rooms to the front and to the back that performed various functioning rooms like storage and spaces like that for the rabbis. It was very simplistic in design. We don't see all of that here, but in the other archaeological site, there's a lot more information. Any questions? On the spelling of Capernaum? Okay, so this is from Mark 2:1. That's the other thing Jesus did. He stayed in house, and as the story goes, people thronged the house all around wanting to see Jesus, and a paralyzed man, his friends, actually opened up the roof and lowered him down into the house. So let's look at that. Average Jewish house would have just been one room. They actually, for most of the time, they lived and worked and even ate outside. The house wasn't the functional space like we understand a house today. So they didn't need more than one room. And the roof of the house was, I'll show you an example here. This is more or less, I guess, what it would have looked like. It was beams, and then it was layered with straw. And some houses had even pile would pile debris and rocks and things on top of the roof to keep it in place. So they would have very much dug a hole in this roof. It wasn't just a case of moving a few tiles. And if you can imagine the things that fell on the people at the bottom, they really made a commotion. Another thing that I didn't actually know, but when the Bible talks about an upper room, they would actually build additional rooms on top of the roof, on top of this structure. That was called an upper room. So some upper rooms were larger than others. Some homes were larger than others that could accommodate such rooms. But it doesn't seem like it's actually quite safe to walk on. It's quite stable, just like any roof today. And they would actually just literally build a room on top of this, so they didn't have a second story that they layered with cement or anything, like we would today. Any questions? Come on, I'm dying for one question. All right, that's fine. Okay, the lost city, and sure. Maybe you guys are saving the questions for this one. This is Jericho, or what's left of it. That's pretty cool. So you see this trench here? Those are archaeologists digging through the different tells of Jericho to explore the different layers of civilization without destroying the entire site. Destroying is a relative term, obviously. This is Tel Jericho, was the tell that was destroyed by God in Joshua. They never built on top of it. In fact, it was abandoned for a few centuries. And we've seen First Kings that somebody went to restore the city, but they built it somewhere else. They never built on top of that. We even see in Jesus going into the city of Jericho and healing lepers at the gate. So by Jesus' time, this was a functioning, normal city, but they left this part alone, which I thought was pretty awesome to see. So the question on everyone's lips, right? The wall. Archaeologists would say that the validity of the story is a hotly debated topic. But if you ask any believer, that just means yes, there is most certainly evidence of that. Undoubtedly so. Secular scientists would just try to deny it. I can't see it from here, but smarter people than me tell us that several parts, majority of the wall did not collapse from the outside in. It was irregular. A lot of it collapsed from the inside out. It wasn't, the archaeological evidence shows that no, something weird happened here. So, well, we know what it is, but this would have been a typical city. It's actually one of the oldest cities in the world. It predates Jerusalem. If they now dig all the way to the bottom in the tells, it was fortified. It had about, maybe they say it could have supported about 5,000 people. It had a massive grain silo, just like many other cities, where they would store food in case they were invaded. That's it. Just an interesting fact about tells as well. On some instances, they found more than 27 layers of civilization where they would just keep building up and up and up. And some of these tells would be about 45 meters tall before the actual city starts. So it was like almost towering cities. The question we always ask at the end of this, how does this help me read my Bible? Sorry, any questions on Jericho? Okay, it was just that one I see. Okay. When Jesus says in Matthew, you are the light of the world, a city set on top of a hill cannot be hidden. In Jerusalem, there were these massive, almost flood-like light lampstands that would light the streets at night. And combine that with the information we have about tells that every single city was built on top of a hill just because of the nature of the tells predating Jesus now. You could see a city at nighttime from 10 kilometers away. It wasn't hidden in a valley or in the middle of trees. Every single city was on top of a hill. And we do understand that it was very well lit. Here's another one. Narratives such as Daniel, some of it is narrative, takes place in Babylon. So if you imagine the artist's rendition there, next time you're reading Daniel, Joshua takes place in Canaan and mentions dozens of cities, Jericho being one of them. And here's just an example. The third year of the reign, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. That's history. We know that even from secular archaeology. And there, Jericho preparing for the invasion. So I'm hoping that these lessons, like I said, gets your imagination working and to start thinking about the Bible and the events and places in real terms. It was extremely helpful to me when I first came across stuff like this. So I'm sharing that with you.